So today's video is finally going to be another solved true crime case. I'm sorry I've had so much time off since Valentine's week. I don't know if you can tell by my voice, but I sound disgusting, and that's because I'm ill right now, so I'll try not to sound too gross. But yeah, hopefully we're back on track now, and hopefully there's going to be regular uploads from here. But today we're going to be talking about the solved case of Rachel Burkheimer. Quickly before I get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So Rachel Rose Burkheimer was an 18-year-old girl born on January 16th, 1984 in Washington in the USA. She lived with her parents, Bill and Denise, along with her older sister Megan, in a city right on the edge of Washington named Everett. Her mother Denise describes her as a precious, special person. She was very likeable, very well behaved, and just an all-round good girl. Rachel was very athletic, and from a very early age as well. She was on a bunch of different sports teams, and everyone said that she was like one of the best, if not the best, on these sports teams. Rachel was really funny as well. Her father Bill believes she could have had a really successful career in comedy or on stage. She could just make people laugh so easily. But the career that Rachel really wanted was to be a vet. She absolutely adored animals. Well, to be fair, a vet was kind of her more practical dream career, but her ultimate dream career was to be an actress. And she was really determined and ambitious as well. She would write her weekly goals on her mirror every week, and then she'd be able to cross them off as she'd done them. Like I said, she was really likeable, and so she had a bunch of friends. She was really quite popular, to the point where her father Bill called himself her personal answering machine, because that many people were ringing the house that he always had to answer. In the early 2000s, when Rachel was still in high school, so she was 16, 17 at this point, she lost 6 of her friends in separate, really tragic ways. One of them drowned, one of them was in an accidental shooting, one of them took their own life, and all of these different losses really took their toll on Rachel. But the death that seemed to affect Rachel the most was the death of her very best friend named Corey Haynes, who passed away in a car crash. Rachel and Corey were very close. Her father says that they were like soulmates. They acted like brother and sister. And all of this grief was very apparent in Rachel. All her family just kind of watched her deteriorate in front of their eyes. She stopped cracking jokes as often. She wasn't as outgoing or ambitious. And by age 18, Rachel decided to drop out of high school early, and she made friends with the kind of people that she'd never really associated with before. Like I said, Rachel was very nice. She was very well behaved and sensible, and so were all of her friends. But this new friend group were the complete opposite of that. This group, most of them had criminal records for violence charges, drug charges. They would steal drugs, they would take drugs all day, they would drink all the time. It was such a difference to what Rachel used to have. The way she got into this group was in 2001, she attended a party where she met a man named John Anderson, who was 2 years older than her. And of course, John introduced her to the rest of his group, and she liked them, and she was fully aware that they were very dangerous. And so she never told her family about this new group of friends. But then one day, Rachel's father received a phone bill for $640, and so he thought, well, this must be a mistake. So he started checking it to see where all this money had gone out from, and he found that Rachel had been calling the local jail. And as it turned out, these calls were to 20-year-old John Anderson, who was serving time in prison. Like I said before, John and his friends all had lengthy criminal records, ranging from violence charges to drug charges to robbery charges. But it wasn't just that, it was actually much more than that. John and all of his friends were actually a part of a gang that they called the Northwest Mafia. And no one in this gang had a job or went to school. They ranged in age from 16 all the way to 32. No one in this gang did anything. They just sat around all day, took drugs, sold drugs, stole drugs, played video games, got drunk, and obviously at this point it had all caught up with John Anderson, and he was serving time for something, I don't know what. But that didn't stop him communicating with his now girlfriend, Rachel Burkheimer. He would call her from jail, but also write physical letters to her. And these letters were very intense, very overwhelming. It was all about John's feelings towards Rachel, and it was kind of obsessive. I've got some quotes here from those letters. He said, "You are my world, you are my everything. You make my heart beat, you make me function, and you make me think. I don't think that I could or would ever want to live without your love." On one of these letters, he simply wrote, "I love you" 33 times over and over again. Another quote, "I don't know any other way of showing you that you are so special to me. I would murder 1,000,000 people if I had to, just to be with you." And so Rachel's father, Bill, kind of sat her down and said, "Look, you can't be doing this. This isn't good. You can't be going out with someone that's in jail." And of course, Rachel saw the good in John Anderson, and she was saying, "No, he's just going through something right now. As soon as he gets out, he'll get his life back on track, and that'll be it. We'll be fine." But Rachel's father was only saying all of that because he was a criminal. Rachel's father had no idea how obsessive and possessive John Anderson could be over Rachel. And Rachel seemed to be a good girlfriend to John. She never cheated, she never went behind his back, she never did anything to provoke this. But Anderson was so insecure that every time he met up with Rachel, he would smell her hair and her clothes to make sure that she hadn't been with other men. Rachel's sister Megan also noticed a lot of bruises on Rachel, and although it can't be confirmed that those were from John Anderson, it seemed as though it was. And whenever Megan would try to talk about it with Rachel, try and ask her where she'd got these bruises from and whatever, Rachel would never want to talk about it. She'd just kind of shrug it off or ignore it. But eventually, a time came when John Anderson was still locked up that her family finally got her to kind of open up about this secret relationship that she'd been having. And so Rachel went into her older sister Megan's bedroom, and they sat on her bed and they were talking into the early hours of the morning. And Rachel was scared. She was telling Megan about his possessiveness, his jealousy, that he always thought that she was cheating on him, and she would say that John would make threats quite often. And so following this conversation with Megan, this kind of opened Rachel's eyes, and so she decided to break things off with Anderson, who was still in prison, and now she was going to try and reclaim her life back. She started going to church again, she started seeing her family and friends more, and the old Rachel was kind of coming back. Rachel's father remembers going out onto the porch one morning and seeing Rachel and remembering her looking so radiant and so full of life. This was a Rachel that he hadn't seen in months. And it was that morning that Rachel told her father that she'd recently made a new friend, a friend going through a very similar situation to her. His name was Maurice Rivas, and he was a former member or transitioning out member of John Anderson's gang, the Northwest Mafia, and that was how Rachel had known him up until now, as part of the gang. And he, just like Rachel, was 18 years old. They were both in this really kind of crappy lifestyle that revolved around crime and everything, but whereas her past had been very good, she'd had a good upbringing, she had a good family, a good home setting, Maurice's was the complete opposite. He was put into foster care from a very young age. His kind of closest biological family contact was his grandmother. He had absolutely nothing to do with his mother or father. And so when he found this kind of family in this gang, it was a family type bond that they had. He really kind of latched onto that, and he really enjoyed being a part of this gang. But something about seeing Rachel leave and improve her life really kind of inspired Maurice. And so he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted Rachel to help him. And so the two of them, Rachel and Maurice, decided together that they were going to go back to school, they were going to graduate, and they were going to get their lives back. They were going to have a normal life from this point on. And this seemed to be going quite well for a few weeks until John Anderson got out of jail, and the two of them just kind of fell back into that old life. Rachel and Anderson quickly got back together once he got out of jail, although this time it was a lot more on and off. Rachel wasn't taking quite as much as she used to. So like before, she used to just let him treat her like crap and she would just put up with it. This time, he would treat her like crap and she would break up with him, but then she'd take him back the next day. And this was a very regular occurrence. And the last time that the two of them split up, Rachel was like, okay, that's it now. I don't ever want to go back to him. And she actually started seeing his friend, which I'm sure you can imagine made Anderson go completely off the rails. And from there, John Anderson hated Rachel. And this kind of planted a seed in his mind that when it was mixed with like his drug-fueled paranoia and delusions, it turned into something much, much bigger. He began telling all his friends that Rachel was a traitor and that she was sharing their secrets, their gang secrets with other people, including their rival gang. Now, we don't know if any of this is true or if it's partly true or if it was just all Anderson's delusions and paranoia, but for him, it was very real. And because it was real to him, it was also real to his friends. Why would his friends not believe him? And so they all began hating Rachel. Somehow word got around that there was a hit on Rachel. A hit meaning that someone wanted to kill her. And rightfully so, she was terrified, and so she went to her older sister Megan about it. But Megan just believed it was the boys just acting tough and giving out false threats to try and scare Rachel into maybe not telling these gang secrets or whatever. They weren't actually gonna do it. So then on September 23rd, 2002, Rachel Burkheimer was invited to a party. I say party, it wasn't a party really. It was just the gang kind of sat around in one of their houses drinking, doing drugs, playing video games, but Rachel really wanted to go. She was really eager to prove herself at this point. She really wanted to just speak to them and get them back on her side. She was really good at that, her dad said. She knew that she hadn't done anything wrong, and so she wanted to put that right. So at about 3 p.m, Maurice and Rachel head over to this party, and everything's going well. Everyone's talking, drinking, doing drugs, whatever. They're having a good time. But of course that didn't last for long. After a while, John Anderson bursts through the door and he is not happy. The story changes depending on what kind of source you're getting it from, which is so frustrating. I couldn't find two sources that said the same story. Some of them say that Anderson wasn't invited to this party and so he found out about it somehow and kind of broke in and was very angry at everyone. Another version of it is that Anderson was out in the garden digging a hole or something and they were all supposed to be helping him and he was frustrated doing it by himself, so he walked in and found Rachel there. Whatever the story, John Anderson bursts through this door and he is so angry. He begins shouting at all the members of the gang. He was punching a few of them, trying to start fights. And then eventually, guns are drawn, and quickly this is really out of hand. And Rachel quickly realised that this was really out of hand. She got scared, and so she got up and tried to sneak towards the door and get out, but she didn't get to the door. Anderson grabbed her as she was running away from him by her hair. He pulled her back, punched her in the face, and then threw her on the floor. And then before she knew it, the rest of the gang had circled around her, and everyone was just beating her and kicking her. And this went on for a few minutes, with one of the men even shouting to another member of the gang to turn up the radio to drown out Rachel's screams. And then it quickly became clear that this whole situation, being invited to the party, John Anderson bursting in and being angry, it wasn't all a coincidence. This had been a plan all along, and all of the gang were in on it. So obviously all those weeks ago when John Anderson was in jail, Rachel left him and she stopped replying to his calls and his letters and everything, and John, as you can imagine, was really upset and really angry. And so he instructed Maurice Rivas, Rachel's new friend, that they were going to work together and get a new life together. He instructed Maurice Rivas to befriend Rachel and gain her trust, and then eventually invited to a little gathering at one of their houses where they could all drink and take drugs and everything. And it was then part of the plan that Anderson would burst in and find Rachel there, start a fight with all of his gang friends, and then eventually Rachel would be involved. So before we go back to the timeline, I just want to introduce you to our different gang members at this point. So of course there was 20-year-old John Anderson and 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, and it later turned out that Maurice Rivas was actually a former roommate of John Anderson's. There was 22-year-old John Whittaker, who was nicknamed Whit, and he was also one of John Anderson's former roommates from when he lived in Mukilteo. 17-year-old Matthew Durham and 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, who were both Maurice Rivas's school friends from when he was in high school. There was Yusuf Jihad, whose nickname was Kevin, and he was the oldest member of the gang at 32 years old. And it was his house where they had this kind of gathering party thing. And Yusuf was also believed to be the kind of leader of this gang, and so he was the one that recruited all these younger boys, including John Anderson. There was 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, and he was a neighbour of Yusuf's, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, who was Yusuf's girlfriend's cousin and also Yusuf's neighbour. So returning to the timeline, the gang all had now dropped this facade that this was all a coincidence, and it was very clear that they were all in on it together. After beating Rachel, they then tied her ankles, tied her wrists, taped over her mouth so that none of the neighbours could hear her screaming. They then grabbed her and took her to Yusuf's garage and left her there for hours while they went back inside and decided what they were going to do next. See, they'd planned this whole thing, but they hadn't planned after the plan. They'd only planned half of it. They'd only planned to get her there and then ambush her, but they didn't know what to do with her now. There was talk of ransom. Anderson believed that Rachel's loving father, Bill, would pay a lot of money to get his daughter back. There was talk of gang rape and further beatings, but the boys just kind of couldn't decide what they wanted to do, and so they didn't decide. For them, there was no rush. They knew that Rachel couldn't go anywhere. She was tied up in the garage, and so they took their time. They ordered a pizza, they played video games, they took drugs, and they just kind of stopped thinking about it. And this went on for 5 hours until 9 p.m. when the garage door finally opened again. But it wasn't a member of the gang, it was a woman. It was Yusuf's girlfriend, Trissa Connor. She'd just arrived home, gone into a garage, and there she found this girl beaten and tied up. And so she goes into her house, she greets all the men and whatever, and then she sneaks off into the kitchen and grabs a kitchen knife. She then went back to the garage and began trying to cut off Rachel's ankle restraints so that Rachel could run away, but she didn't get very far before the men followed her out. Anderson pushed Trissa out of the way so she couldn't cut Rachel free, and Trissa began shouting at the men saying, "You shouldn't have done this anyway, you shouldn't have brought her here." She then said that she would call the police if they didn't take Rachel off of the property. Not if they didn't let Rachel go, just make sure you get her off of my property. So the men did as they were told. They grabbed a black duffel bag and put Rachel inside it, zipped it up, and then put it in the boot of a Jeep and drove away. They were driving around for hours, just aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do with her because they hadn't figured out what to do with her. They'd just spent the last 5 hours just doing drugs and playing video games and eating pizza. There was talk of maybe just letting her go. She'd learned a lesson now. She wasn't gonna tell any gang secrets or whatever they believed she was doing. She would have learnt a lesson by now. They thought, well, we could just get a hotel for a few days and stay with her until all of her wounds heal up and whatever, and then just let her go. But of course that didn't happen. It wasn't actually up to the men in that car driving her around what was going to happen to Rachel, because at this point John Anderson wasn't with them. And so as the men were thinking about this, they were thinking, hang on, why are we stressing about what to do with her when it's not even our mess? This is John Anderson's mess. We can pick him up and he can decide what to do. But as it was, there was no room in the car to pick Anderson up. That's obviously why he wasn't in the car in the first place. And so they pulled up onto this kind of mountain trail named Mill Creek. By this point, it was around 11 p.m. Maurice Rivas gets out of the Jeep, he goes round to the trunk, pulls out this duffel bag with Rachel Burkheimer still inside it, and the two of them wait at this mountain trail for the rest of them to go and pick up John Anderson. Some sources say that Maurice spoke to Rachel for a little bit while they were waiting for the rest of them, and he was saying things like he thinks it'll be okay and he thinks they'll let her go. And Rachel was pleading with Maurice to just let her go. Her family would pay as much money as they needed to just let her go, although she could tell that there wasn't really much hope. Rachel Burkheimer knew that she was gonna die, and so she looked at Maurice Rivas and she pleaded with him, just please don't drown me. Anything but drowning. I couldn't find what Maurice said to her or anything like that, but at some point he zipped up this duffel bag again and they waited until the rest of them got back. So meanwhile, the men were in the car going to pick up John Anderson, and they got to where he lived, and John got in the car with a bunch of shovels and a pick, and he just kind of sat there and said, drive. When they finally arrived back at this mountain trail, they drove the car out to a kind of softer bit of land, and there John Anderson and John Whittaker began digging. Maurice Rivas stayed over by the car and he was like drinking and smoking, and John Anderson got really angry at him for not joining in, and so he shouted to him to come and help. And as they were digging, Rachel began making noises from this duffel bag, and so John Anderson went over to it and hit it as hard as he could with a shovel to shut her up. After some more digging, Anderson let Rachel Burkheimer out of this duffel bag and untied her, and then he ordered John Whittaker to undress her and take off all her kind of jewellery and everything. But Rachel said, no, I can do it myself, I can undress myself, and she did, all the way down to her last ring, which she actually pleaded with Anderson to let her keep on. See, this ring was actually given to her by her best friend that died in the car crash, Corey Haynes, and if she was going to die, she wanted to die with that on. But of course, Anderson said no and ordered her to take it off. And so she did as she was told, and then she collapsed to the floor and began praying, to which Anderson said, don't worry, you'll be up there soon too. And then Anderson ordered Rachel Burkheimer to go and lay in this grave that they dug for her, face down in the dirt, and she did. It was then that Anderson took out a gun and began shooting her in the back and in the head. He shot around half his bullets, and then his gun actually got jammed, and so he stopped for a couple of seconds, kind of cleared his gun out, and then shot the rest of his bullets as well. So all the men, including Anderson, then filled up the rest of this grave, and then on the drive home, Anderson said to the rest of them that loose ends will be cut off, meaning that if anyone involved in this snitched on anyone or told anyone that this had happened, then they would probably be killed. And if not them, then their family. Once they got back, some of the men then drove Rachel's car by her ex's house, possibly to maybe frame him for a disappearance. Meanwhile, Anderson disposes of the gun by throwing it in a nearby pond, while Maurice Rivas and Matthew Durham gather all of Rachel's clothes and all the jewellery and put them in a pillowcase and try and burn them. After about a day or two, Rachel's family were getting very worried. Obviously, she hadn't come home, she hadn't contacted anyone, although honestly, this wasn't entirely out of character. Like I said, she'd fallen back into this gang life. She was going out and not telling anyone where she was every single day. She was breaking the law. This wasn't unlike her, and while the family obviously wasn't happy with it, they trusted her to come back. It was nothing that she hadn't done before. She'd always come back every time. Why wouldn't she this time? Going on day 3, and there was still no sign of Rachel, still no calls or anything, and so her family said, right, enough is enough. If she's not here tomorrow morning when we wake up, we go to the police station and we file a missing persons report. And of course she wasn't back the next morning, and that's exactly what they did. Very quickly, search parties were going out looking for Rachel. There were missing persons posters all over the town. They were doing public appeals on the news.
All we know is Rachel would not be away this long without contacting someone. And we do know that wherever she is, that she's not there by choice.
And this was quickly becoming a very well-known missing persons case in that area, and so it wasn't long until there was a breakthrough. One of the gang members' mothers, Jeffrey Barth's mother, came forward to police saying that she knew that the boys often used Matthew Durham's Jeep to get around. I don't know if she knew anything about Rachel or about that night or anything, or if she knew that her son was involved in any way, but she knew that the boys used that Jeep, and so she thought it would be of use to tell the police. And so police brought 17-year-old Matthew Durham in for questioning, and they basically just sat him down and said, look, we know that you know something about this. You can tell us now and you can get less time for snitching on your friends, or you can do it quietly and get a longer sentence. And so, of course, he snitched on all of his friends. He also led detectives to the specific mountain trail where they'd killed Rachel, although because it was dark and he didn't really know his way around there, he didn't know exactly where the body was. And so police brought in search teams and cadaver dogs, and they were searching this whole massive area for days, until eventually one of the cadaver dogs alerted to a specific spot. So searchers grabbed a shovel and began digging, and they literally didn't even have to put it in twice. The first time they put the shovel in, they hit something, and that was human flesh. It was Rachel Burkheimer, and so her body was recovered, and she was actually found with her hands in a praying position underneath her. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Matthew Durham was telling police everything they wanted to know because he wanted that shorter sentence. He told them who he was with, where they lived, exactly what every single person's part in the murder was. Of course, he told police that they'd started off in Yusuf's home, which was where this kind of party was being held, and so police went straight there and got a search warrant. And there they found the pillowcase with the burnt remains of Rachel's clothing and jewellery in it. And so now they could confirm that Durham back at the police station was completely telling the truth. As the search was continuing of this mountain trail and the dogs were going around and search teams were going around, they also found a gun in one of the ponds. And of course it's not a coincidence that a girl had been found shot to death and there was a gun ditched in a pond. Of course that was the murder weapon. But just to confirm, police tested the bullet casings found at the site of Rachel's murder with the ones that this gun used, and of course those kind of bullets were used in that gun. Meanwhile, at John Anderson's home, where none of this had actually taken place, they found the same duct tape that was used to cover Rachel's mouth and the shovels that were used to dig her grave. So all in all, 8 people were arrested and put on trial, which is the whole 8 that I told you about earlier. 5 of these 8 boys took a plea deal, so they pled guilty to whatever their charges were, I'll tell you in a second, so they could all get lesser sentences. So the first of one of these 5 boys to plead guilty to their charges was 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace. He was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree kidnapping and first-degree rendering criminal assistance. He was essentially just there. He didn't do anything, but he also didn't do anything to stop it, and so he had to serve some time for that. And so for those charges, he was sentenced to just 30 days in prison, although he probably only served about 2 weeks, probably less of that. Next was 20-year-old Tony Williams. He was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Tony Williams was the one to duct tape Rachel's mouth, and he was also the one to turn up the radio to drown out her screams. And for his part in this whole thing, he was sentenced to just 9 years. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth was charged with all the same as the last one, first-degree murder, first-degree kidnap, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He was present when Rachel was held hostage, and he also bragged to some of his inmates that he hit Rachel with the barrel of his gun, and for that he was sentenced to 10 years. So now we're getting on to the kind of bigger sentences. Still bear in mind that these men pled guilty. 17-year-old Matthew Durham was charged with first-degree murder. Of course, it was him driving the Jeep. He was driving toward that mountain trail knowing full well that Rachel was going to be murdered there. And for that, he was sentenced to 26 years. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas was charged with first-degree murder. Again, he helped with this whole abduction plot. He was the biggest part of this abduction plot. He also helped to dig Rachel's grave and also helped to bury her in that grave. And for that he was sentenced to 26 years. And the last 3 men didn't take plea deals. They didn't plead guilty at first, and so they still had to go on trial. And these were, of course, John Anderson, John Whitaker, and Yusuf Jihad. John Anderson, all the way through his trial, behaved shockingly. He would smile at the courtroom cameras. He would laugh at some of the things being said in court. He would turn and look at Rachel's family and wink at them. 20-year-old John Anderson was, of course, found guilty of all of his charges, and he potentially faced the death penalty, but was ultimately just given life in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was also found guilty of all of his charges, and he too could have faced the death penalty, but again, he wasn't given it and he was just sentenced to life in prison. 32-year-old Yusuf Jihad was again found guilty of all of his charges and he was sentenced to 37 years in prison. But yeah, that completes this case, a really, really heavy one. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a big thumbs up because that really helps me out. Subscribe down below if you want to see some more content from me. A huge thank you to all of my channel members. All of their names are on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the link in the description, or if you're on a desktop, you can click the join button under the video. If you become a channel member, you'll get your name on this end card, and you'll also have access to a members only community tab where I will ask for case suggestions, do polls to see what cases come next, and you can just have a lot more say in what you see on the channel. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!